Brantley here. Welcome back to another edition of the Independent Sponsor Update, brought to you today by Frisch Capital Partners, where every day Frisch Capital is helping put together the capital that independent sponsors need to successfully close their transactions. So Bob, today I want to talk about how capital sources look at your deal, at a transaction, at any independent sponsor's transaction.
Okay.
Now there's two main capital sources out there that we deal with. There's debt and then there's equity. Now on the debt side, we've got multiple types, whether it's senior, mezz, or whatever it is. And then we've got equity on the other side. And
Right.
sometimes people will do a little bit of both. But regardless, the different capital sources, depending on whether they're debt or equity, are looking at different things in different ways, because how they're going to invest their money in an independent sponsor's transaction, in your transaction, is going to be different. Okay,
Right.
So let's talk a little bit. How does a debt player look at an independent sponsor's deal? What's the lens that they're looking through?
Debt players, yes, they like to look forward in a transaction. There's no doubt about it. Can the company perform going forward? But they're interested only in, is their interest covered? Are the fixed charges, are the company's charges, the fixed charges covered? Can the company not only pay the interest but pay them back? That's the forward look that they have. But most importantly, they judge that forward look on the past historical performance. So they'll go back 1, 2, or even 3 years back to look at the performance of the company to make sure that their debt, that is their interest and their principal, will get paid back in the future. That's the way debt players operate.
And so if we think about the trends that they're looking for, they're not necessarily worried about, is this thing skyrocketing in growth? What they're wanting to see is it consistently performing to be able to pay back that debt.
Exactly. They don't have the same hat. We'll get into equity in a minute, but they don't have that hat on. They have a hat that, can you pay my debt back? Can you pay me my interest over the next 3, 5 years, whatever it may be? You got to keep in mind, this is really important. Debt players with their low interest, that's all they get. If a deal goes bad in a debt provider's world, it takes a lot of other deals to make up all that debt that they put onto that transaction. They only get, it depends, somewhere between 4% for senior, maybe, or 12% for mezzanine. But still, that's not a lot of money for them compared to the amount of money they're putting out the door. They have to make sure that money's paid back. They look historically to make sure the future is going to provide that money.
So they're protecting their downside. What are the things that they're looking at? Because in my mind, immediately I go to assets, to inventory. What else?
Okay, they're asset-based lenders and they're cash flow lenders. Asset-based lenders are looking to receivables, inventory, machinery and equipment, real estate, things of that nature. The further down the liability side, the harder it is to get that debt player. So if you're at receivables, that's easier. If you're at inventory, that's a little bit more difficult, maybe, but receivables and inventory. You go into machinery and equipment and appraisals, then the universe gets a little bit smaller. You go into real estate and it gets much smaller, lending up against those assets. But then there are the cash flow lenders that'll lend on a senior basis, usually sometimes around 3 times today, maybe a little bit more. They're struggling because of various regulations right now. Then you have the mezzanine players that are much higher interest rate, and they can lend as much as they want to into the transaction, but they get a pretty good rate for that.
Gotcha. Okay, so on the debt side, they're looking historically, can they pay back the debt, and do they have either the assets or the inventory or the cash flow or whatever it is, the receivables, to be able to pay that back?
Correct.
So that's what they're looking at. Now let's talk about the equity side.
Before we go there, one final thing.
Yeah, sure.
One final thing. The debt players will try to go back as much as they can, and we're a good 10 years away from it right now, and look at a recession. They want to know, and that might not be in the last 3 years, but they want to figure out how a company will perform in a recession. That's very important. So they'll try to go back to 2007, but that world in many cases is much different than it is today, but that's important for debt players.
Yeah, and especially for companies, you think that's, 11 years essentially prior to the recession at this point.
Right.
Many companies have shifted what they do, how they do, and so it's almost, apples to oranges. It's not apples to apples when you're comparing them at that point.
It is, but many debt players have the attitude there will be a recession over the next 5 years.
So they want to see how can you handle that, or how have you handled it historically.
Exactly.
Makes sense. All right. So now let's go to the equity side.
Okay.
So what is the lens that equity players use to look at a transaction?
Well, it's not the same lens. That's important to realize. Equity players sit there and they look at the future. Yes, they look at historically how the company has performed, but they're looking much more at margins and trend. They want that trend line to be up, up, and away. They're looking at their equity not from a point of view of historical, can you cover interest, or they're not getting interest. They're looking, when we sell that company, have you taken that EBITDA from a level here, let's say 3 up to a 5? Have you grown that company? Because at that point in the future, that's what they're looking at. How much of a return, IRR, cash on cash return, are we going to get for putting those equity dollars to work?
So the story that they're wanting to hear is a story of growth.
Yeah.
They're not looking to see, can they cover the bases? They're not looking for, is my downside protected? They want to know, what's the growth, what's the story that's going to get there?
Yeah.
Is that right?
And go ahead.
So as somebody thinks about painting a picture, telling a story to different capital sources, whether it is a debt player versus an equity, what's the difference? What do they need to think about differently?
Well, keep in mind the debt players are going to look at facts back. They're going to go backwards. They'll look at the first 12 months, 2 years, whatever, out into the future, but they're looking at the facts back. The equity players are looking at the pro forma future, and that hasn't come about yet. Independent sponsors have to realize over and over again, and this is something that we see all the time, the equity players want to see that growth. They want to see the potential. Independent sponsors have this unique ability, many of them, to show, well, I'll show that lower case. I won't show that growth that I really think is going to happen. I'll show a downside case from that, and that'll be the case I show my equity players. And that's, in my view, a huge mistake, because the capital sources for the independent sponsors oftentimes say, well, if that's the best you think you're going to do, then why would I do this deal? Or maybe I'll even decrease that even further. Best foot forward is the best expression I can think of for an independent sponsor. Put that case out there. If you think you're going to do that 10% growth, don't put 5%. Put that 10% growth. Let them see that. Keep in mind, your promote as an independent sponsor is predicated on the fact that that company's going to perform well. Your dollars you're going to get at the end of the day as an independent sponsor are going to be predicated on how much equity they give you. Their equity that they give you in your promote is dependent on that growth scenario that you painted for them. It's critical.
So be able to paint that optimistic but realistic picture of growth, be able to support it with data or information that you believe this is realistic, this is true, and don't undersell yourself, because they're going to discount it anyways. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, okay, well, if they think that, then I'm going to take 20% down. I mean, whatever it might be.
They do that, and we sell you as an independent sponsor. We tell them, you can do this. You will do this as an independent sponsor. You have the experience in the industry. You know the finance side of the equation. You're bringing something to the table. We actually sell you into the deal. We sell the deal. But if you say you're only going to do this, then nothing we can say will raise that higher. We need the independent sponsors to understand that expression. Best foot forward.
All right, so there we have it, guys. The difference between debt and equity and the lens that those capital sources are going to look through. Debt players are looking historically. Can they service the debt? Can they pay off the interest? Do they have whether it's the assets, the cash flow, the receivables, the inventories, whatever it is, to be able to pay off that debt should things not work properly or into the future? Equity players, on the other hand, they want to see the promise. They want to see the growth. They want to see that trend line moving in an upward direction from the left to the right of that graph.
Absolutely critical.
All right. Thanks again for watching, guys. Check out our other editions of the Independent Sponsor Update, where we help provide you with the tips, techniques, and tools to successfully close your transactions. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Joe.